This is Great Minds in Regional Science. The first session is from 10 to 10:35. Great Minds in Regional Science, Alfred Weber and Rick Church is going to give us the lead in on this. So Rick, turning it over to you.
Okay, I guess I need to share my screen, right? Okay.
I think so.
Share, okay. Can everybody see that then?
I can.
Yep. Okay, great. Yeah, I suppose this might be Great Minds in Regional Science presented by lesser minds. I didn't know that I was going to be making this presentation until about a week and a half ago when I was looking at the schedule, and I did just a kind of a general search for my name, and up popped this on Monday morning, and I thought, oh my gosh, I better do something. But I did have a presentation because I've made a presentation once before about Alfred Weber, and this is sort of a refined talk about that. Anyway, a short biography, and it's really important in understanding Weber. That is Alfred. It's not Alfredo, but Alfred Weber. It's Alfredo listed in the program. Anyway, it's really important to understand where Alfred Weber came from and what his family did in terms of forming his basically his beliefs in terms of research direction and so forth. He was born in 1868. He died at the age of 90 in 1958. His father was well placed politically and held a doctorate of laws, so he was relatively well educated. He was held a number of political appointments, including serving on the Prussian House of Representatives. And what is also very important is that he had his father was so politically connected that there were lots of visitors in Alfred's home as he was growing up, and among them a number of notable scholars and politicians and so forth. So it was a really rich environment to grow up in the late 1800s. Alfred Weber was one of 8 children, of which his brother Maximilian, or Max Weber, was the most successful. So Alfred was really in a bit of the shadow of his brother, who was older. He started his university studies at the University of Heidelberg, and then continued. Then after a year or two, he moved on to the University of Berlin, and he eventually passed the examination to practice law, and he earned a doctorate of laws in 1889. He completed a habilitation degree, which was, notable achievement. And his subject matter at the time was Roman agrarian history and its significance to the law. So he shared a lot of interest with his father. And he followed his brother Max into the academic life at the University of Berlin, because Max actually was at the University of Berlin on the faculty there in 1899. He eventually moved to the University of Heidelberg, where he had originally started his university studies in 1907, and he retired in 1933. But he continued to be active in writing until 1958, at the time he died. He's best known in our field for his book that is translated into English as The Theory of Location of Industries, and he wrote this in 1909 at the University of Heidelberg. he probably became far more famous after his book was translated into English by Carl Friedrich in 1929. And that was, Carl Friedrich was working as an economist at the University of Chicago. And so I think his work really became into more prominence once that translation appeared in the literature. I know that there were a lot of earlier people that were influenced by Weber's work, but it's clear that Walter Izard was influenced in terms of books like his Location and Space Economy, and as well as many others, including Martin Beckman, who was one of our founders of our regional science. And there's even a Martin Beckman Regional Science Association International Annual Award in Martin Beckman's honor. And that is, it's clear that Martin Beckman was also very, very highly influenced by Alfred Weber's work. Anyway, to really understand Alfred and where he went is to also understand Max. And Max, as I had said it before, he joined the faculty at the University of Berlin. And Max established himself in sociology. He is considered to be one of the founders of modern sociology, and he's more famous than Alfred is. Max's earlier writings had significant influence on Alfred. And from 1920 on, Alfred Weber really was enmeshed in the studies of history, philosophy, culture, and basically sociology as well. So Alfred's best known in the field in terms of sociology for his book on culture that was published in 1935. And this explored his book explored the relationship between knowledge and culture. And so, if you will, his book on location of industries is but a footnote in a very long career of academic writings outside of economics. So we look at Alfred in terms of his achievements in terms of economics, but he was clearly well represented, as well respected in the field of sociology and philosophy as well. Anyway, there is a typical view of Alfred Weber, and it's this locational triangle. And this is the view that one gets from both the geometrical discussion of George Pick in the mathematical appendix to Alfred Weber's book, where there's a factory being located somewhere between the two localized raw material sources. The raw material has to be transported to the factory, and then the factory produces some kind of good, and then that good is then transported to the market. Now, so this is the typical view that you get from reading about Alfred Weber in economic geography and even regional science books. My earlier understanding of Weber is derived primarily from derivative works and not Weber's book itself. Location Theory by Martin Beckman was a particularly important one in terms of when I was beginning my studies in this field. And a paper by Kuhn and Gne called An Efficient Algorithm for the Numerical Solution of the Generalized Weber Problem. And I'll speak about that in a few minutes. Weisfeld's paper that was written in French in a Japanese journal. So it was pretty much hidden until after Kuhn and Kuhne's paper. But Weisfeld actually produced an algorithm that could be used to solve generalized, what is some people think of as a generalized Weber problem, but it's really a special case of Weber's problem. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. And then Leon Cooper, he was a good friend of mine. He wrote a paper in Journal of Regional Science on the extension of the generalized Weber problem, which really wasn't an extension at all, because there was a lot of misunderstanding of exactly what Weber did. And then Virgin Rogers in management science, he did something as well in an algorithm for, in a computational procedure for locating economic facilities. And he did it for both in a Euclidean geometric sense, like Weber did, but also in a rectilinear grid Manhattan metric. Okay. Kuhn and Gne's so-called generalized Weber problem looked like this. There's a facility that's providing service to a number of demand points. There are no localized raw materials. And I believed at the time when I read Kuhn and Gne's paper that, hey, this is a generalized problem. I knew about the 3-point problem and so forth. This is a generalization. Again, it was a single facility location problem, trying to serve as efficiently as possible by minimizing cost times distance or weighted distance to serving all the demand. And Cooper's so-called generalization looked like this. It was where there were multiple facilities being located, and each facility would be serving their closest demands, and you wanted to locate two or what he referred to as P facilities in order to minimize the weighted distance to serving each total of all the demands, while each demand is served by the closest or cost efficient facility. There's the Weber problem, the triangle problem, and then there's Cooper's problem, generalization into multiple facilities, and then there's Kuhn and Gne's visualization of having more than 3 points. Now, in classic view, I'd like to give just some notation so you can see where I'm going to come from here. There's a raw material source, and we can, 2 raw material sources here. The raw materials are transformed, they're brought together, and they're transformed into a weighted product. So we can establish that there are coordinates for both the raw materials and the coordinates for the marketplace, and also coordinates for the factory. And if you will, I'm not going to go over all of this notation, but just kind of give you a flavor for what's happening. The objective is very simple. It's to minimize the weight times the distance of the raw material 1, weight times the distance of raw material 2, and the weight times the distance for the finished product. And then the distances are defined as Euclidean distances, although this has been expanded in the literature in terms of using Manhattan metric and other metrics as well. The unweighted case, I might add on the bottom here, there's a note that the unweighted case has all the weights assigned as equal to 1, and that's particularly important within the context of some geometrical work. But there was a person by the name of Laundhard, and in the 1870s and 1880s, he produced several monographs that were published in German. And he minimized, if you will, this is the same as the Weber problem, except that there are these terms U. So here we have a cost times weight times distance. Cost times weight times distance. This is the unit cost of transporting a unit weight somewhere between 2 points. And where U is the annual interest of the capital costs, yearly maintenance cost per kilometer, and all installation costs of a conveyance system. So what Lownhart was doing the same thing that Weber did, except that it was 20 to 30 years earlier. And he was minimizing not only just the transportation costs, but also the costs of building the roads, he usually was interested in railroads, but the transportation device, if you will, the roads or rail lines or whatever, as well as the cost of the transport in terms of location of the facility. So if you go further, you'd have to say, yikes, Lownhart proposed the location triangle earlier, and the problem including building the transport system. This is clearly, puts Weber in a different light, because Weber's model seems to be less, like a special case of Lownhart. So let's round out the picture. I just want to give you a little bit of history of this of the triangle construct. It's the pure mathematical problem is an unweighted case. It's originally done by Fermat, posed the problem, and Torricelli and Cavalieri in the 1600s produced a solution to it. As a pure mathematical question, a weighted case, it was proposed by a guy by the name of Simpson, who was an English guy, and he wrote a book on the theory of fluxions and showed how to solve this problem. And then there's the appendix in Weber's book by George Pick that also proposes a geometrical way to solve this problem. And then there's a physical model by Varinon in the 1600s. And then you have the economically inspired problem by Lownhart. And of course, then you also have Weber, but he seems to be kind of late in the game. Lownhart, so if you looked at the algorithmic developments for more of the weighted case, you'd see Lownhart for 3 points. Weisfeld or Vasnelier, he was changed his name to protect him in the Nazi time of the Nazis, but he produced this in 1937. And then Mele's work in 1958 in management science, Cooper's work in 1963 in regional science, and Kuninkune's work as well. Cooper and Kuninkune called their problems generalized problems. So we have some important commentaries associated with this, because Pinto was the one that is perhaps the earliest that began to raise the work of Lownhart as being hidden and very important. And then Poirier, in 1998, he had a paper discussing Lownhart and Weber, and basically said, he had a section of his paper said, should we forget about Weber? So here we have what we might consider a great mind, and I certainly do, as suggested 20 years ago that we should forget about him, perhaps. Poirier did suggest that there were issues that were discussed by Weber in terms of agglomeration and specialization of labor that were particularly important concepts. And he basically said, at this point in time, Weber should be recognized for that, but not necessarily for the 3-point problem. And then we have Gerbet, Laporte, Stefan Nickel, and Sadal de Gama in 2015. They presented the work of Lownhart's in their introduction of an edited volume on location science as some of the long lost approach that now deserves attention over that of Weber. In fact, they kind of intimated that we should call this the Lownhart problem. But so am I done? Is Weber's model really insignificant when viewed from the lens of Lownhart? Does Lownhart cast such a large shadow that Weber should be forgotten? And my answer is equivalently no. Weber's work is extremely significant. And in fact, I believe that from what I've read and really understand in terms of Weber's book, he really is the founder of logistics. So the answer to this, I believe, lies in the fact that we should read his book rather than the Cliff Notes versions that we get in virtually all texts and papers. Everybody has pigeonholed Weber, except for his discussion on agglomerations and specialization of labor, into what is the three-point problem called the locational triangle. But I believe understanding it is really more of a function of Ackoff's OR as a science. I'm going to speed through some of this. I have a number of other slides here, but I'm going to speed through the notation and get you hopefully kind of a good picture of how Weber thought. Yeah, this really meant that I had to read Weber's book rather than, and I did this in the 1990s, and I was struck by the fact that Weber understood so much more than what he had been recognized for in the past. To begin, Weber never considered the problem to be limited to 3 points, but many of his figures involve 3 points, and he didn't call it a locational triangle. He called it a locational figure because he basically thought 3 points were enough to define the concept, not necessarily reflect that the problem is only always involved 3 points. And he makes this point very clear. And then he also basically says, he suggested that more than 3 points, this is in his book, can be handled by the physical analog model of variant. And he also suggested the construct of isotems and isotopanes, that is, lines of constant transport, as well as lines of equal total transport, and to construct exactly where the optimal location is going to be. Now, of course, if Weber had proposed this at the time when we had MATLAB or something of that nature, it would have been very easy for him just to construct this himself. And this is, these figures are really reminiscent of Izard's classic book, Location and Space Economy. But Weber was clearly showing that he understood how you could solve this by developing this kind of graph. Now, to understand this further, we have to go through Ackoff's OR as a science, and it's very simple. He suggested that if you're doing operations research as a science, first of all, you have to come up with a verbal statement of the problem. Then you construct a mathematical model. Then you derive some kind of solution process for the model. You then use that solution process in the model to generate solutions for which you're doing post-optimality analysis and so forth. And then you try to establish some kind of controls over the solution, which involves defining exactly when that solution is going to be a good solution as compared to the conditions changing and you need to change your solution. And then finally implementing the solution. So if I use Ackoff as a lens, I believe that this is the process that most people that are doing spatial optimization, location modeling, and location science use. Most of the people working in the field concentrate on a few of the steps, but not the whole process. And some work on formulating a model and modeling a problem. Others work on maybe concentrating their work on how to solve a specific problem and coming up with an algorithmic approach. And still others may be involved in the application of a model, but never having developed a model or the solution. And what it amounts to is I believe that Weber's paradigm in his book is far more than a location triangle. And what it amounted to is he completed a form of completing step 1 in Ackoff's OR is a science 6-step approach. That is, he developed a real foundation for the problems that were involved that needed to be solved, and suggested some ways that we might solve. So Weber's simple problem, I've already described that, has really many more raw materials and sources and markets than just 2 raw materials in a market. So the generalization is where you actually have summed over a number of markets and a number of demands, or I mean, number of raw materials and number of demands. But most people in location science treat this as if it involves only a second term without the factors of the weight of the raw materials, and that is that the generalization that they believe only incurs this term here, but not the first term. So that the classic model of Weber is indeed excuse me, told me spam red. The classic model of Weber is indeed more expansive than what Kuhn and Gne thought was the generalized model. And Weber also reasoned that there could be several sources of a given raw material, so that the figure, he produces figures that look like this, so that he has here, like I have raw material source 1, I should say raw material 2, source 1, raw material 2, source 2. And he basically says raw materials need to be allocated and will depend on where the closest sources are to the factory. So that when you look at it, his locational figure that you see in his text, he's basically clearly defining that there's this polygon around, this convex polygon around the material sources that are being used, but beyond this, it represents a condensation of the fact that the factory is taking these really closer sources of raw materials rather than ones that are farther away. So that he's basically suggesting that, well, I'm giving you this picture, but the picture, the landscape is much more complex, and that this is after those allocations have already been made. So that if you wanted to solve this problem, or at least formulate it, you have to have allocation variables for the raw material sources. That's right here. This second part here, allocation variables. And then Weber's, I'm going to call it his basic model, where he has resource selection / allocation, as well as a location model and serving the demands. So Weber basically, and I see that I'm almost running out of time, and I have a few more slides here. Weber stated that locational figures will always be individual or specific for a particular plant. That is, he's defining the locational figure around a plant and saying, is this plant located optimally amongst the raw materials it's using and the demands it's supplying? And so what he was really suggesting is that the landscape, there are other facilities or plants being located in order to serve the other demands across the landscape. That is, he had a multi-facility point of view. So this can be depicted in the following way, where you have, in this case, I've depicted 2 factories and various raw material sources. And so if you start to formulate this model, you'll see that it's far more complicated and mathematically than any of the problems that we've ever developed and solved in the Weber framework. So that here we have to have not only, if you will, if the bottom of the screen here, you have to have allocation variables for both the raw materials and the demands that are being served by a given by a given factory. So if I back up here, you'll see that there are markets that are being served or demands that are being served by the factories, as well as the raw materials are being allocated to the factories based upon what's the closest source. And these change as your factories move across the landscape. So that what the ultimate problem is a highly nonlinear problem where you have multi-plant location, you have resource allocation, and you have market allocation. So it will happen that normal outputs, this is right out of Weber's book, normal output for the most favorable raw material source may not be sufficient to supply the demand of a place of some consumption. In this case, less favorable material deposits will be brought into play. The basic idea is that Weber was saying that there can be capacities for localized raw materials, and that this needed to be taken into account. And it's just, if you have two sources of a given raw material, you might end up having to use both of those sources rather than just taking the closest one. So nobody ever told me that Weber considered capacities, but if you look at how do you do this, you then have to look at the fact that the problem, the locational figure, looks far more complex. Then, by the way, he does hint at this, but it's always within the context of the figure that includes just one factory. Anyway, so you have to define even more sources, more variables here, because now you have to be worried about the flow of the materials in terms of not just allocating a given raw material, but now you have to worry about how much raw material you're getting from each of the sources in order to minimize that cost. So there's a basic model 4 that is a capacitated model. And then I do want to say that I'm almost done here, and I want to say that Weber was very clear in the fact that, and he has a very nice diagram for this in his book. Let us suppose that an industry is influenced only by the cost of transportation. Let us neglect all of the deviating influence of labor and agglomeration. What given assumptions does it mean that the production process does not need to be entirely performed at one location, but split among a number of parts which may be completed at different locations? The only cause which could lead to a resultant transfer of the parts from different locations would obviously be that some ton miles may be saved in the process. So what he's really suggesting is production could be staged. You could have one stage where some of the product is made, and then that material or that semi-finished product then moves on to the next stage and so forth, so that you could have a, if you will, a stage location problem with product flow. And I'm just going to give you a figure here for two-stage production problem, where you have factory at production stage 1, taking raw materials, maybe raw material 1 and 2, producing a product that is needed by the factory production stage 2, and then it also needs an additional raw material that comes from something. And by the way, raw materials don't necessarily have to be primary sourced raw materials, but they could be secondary. They could be parts like screws and bolts and nuts and other kinds of things as well. So now you have stage production serving a market. And again, if you want to, I have a paper that's available that has these formulations in it, but the classic Weber model has the stage production of raw materials, the product flow costs, the transportation costs between the stages, and then finally, this is a two-stage production problem, and then finally the delivery of the finished product to the demands. Okay, so summary. Okay, Weber called this his figure a locational figure, not a triangle. It's a major distinction, and it's really a misinterpretation of Weber. Weber always recognized that there could be more than 3 points. He suggested a solution approaches to this, even though that everybody says, oh, Alfred Pick helped him out, wrote this mathematical geometrical treatise as an appendix to his book. But Weber was clearly suggested other things like drawing isotopanes and so forth. Weber never formulated a mathematical model per se, but he introduced all the factors of the problem, and he discussed various components of the problem. He definitely did back off stage 1. He suggested alternative sources for a given raw material, capacitated sources of raw material, multi-plant location, stage production of multiple sites, and multiple plant location. And I think without a doubt, Weber's location paradigm is rich, nuanced, and complex, and not a simple locational triangle. I do want to have I haven't focused on his discussion of agglomeration tendencies or discussion of spatial labor specialization, but those are important concepts as well. The notation that industries would increase transport when sufficient labor costs could be saved. He basically said, you know, you could have a plant that is located a long ways away from the market and the raw materials if labor is really cheap somewhere. You could save so he basically said that labor in a way is a raw material or a source as well. And so he suggested the very same concepts of like moving a plant to China and saving labor rather than manufacture it closer to markets. And then I basically believe that overall it's a rich idea-laden book, which has not been appreciated for the wide-ranging concepts raised, and as compared to what he's known for, the locational triangle. And thank you. I'm definitely over my time, but we started a bit late.
Yeah, we did. Go ahead, put it down.
Oh, you want me to stop sharing here? Okay, I'm stopping the share.
Good.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you. I think that was really, really very interesting, and I'm trying to figure out how to get us onto the whole thing here. I just can't get the double screen where my screen working. There we are. It's not gonna do it. There. Good. Anyway, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yep. I think we now want to turn it over to general discussion. I do want to mention one thing, and that is that this underappreciation of some of the work done by various groups, I think, is really important. I think this thing you raised about Weber, which I did not know ahead of time, I think is really fascinating. I think if you look at Francois Perrot's work on growth pole theory, most people have it as this relatively simple system of a pole and distributions around it and playing with different complementarities or whatever between the center and the periphery. Really is a very understatement of this very complex discussion he has of agglomeration economies, and agglomeration economies that are not only agglomeration in an economic sense, but in a political sense. And people just have bypassed all of that. And so I think this exploring of it in the Weber sense, it really gives me a feeling of the fact that we should do this in a lot more other areas. So let me back off that and open it up for discussion. Thank you. Ideas? Somebody wants to open it up, ask questions?
Kingsley, Peter here.
Peter.
Yeah.
Rick, you did really a fantastic job. I like your presentation, and having studied Alfred Weber in the past, it was really nice to see him back on the scene. I have a couple of small questions, perhaps. The Weber problem looks, as you also have articulated, looks seemingly very simple. A simple triangle and you solve a problem. The more you dive into it, and you really did it, the more complicated it becomes. And it is even more complicated than you have suggested, because there might also be input substitution, for instance, which adds another dimension. There might be different truck companies with different transportation rates, again, another complexity. There might be scale advantages in the production sector of raw materials. So the more realistic you get, the more complicated, of course, it gets. And in fact, it was already all in Weber. Now, the question I have is, you see, Weber at some stage, unfortunately perhaps, he stopped with his economic analysis and he moved into different fields in which he could not compete with his brother. So he became, let's say, far less known as well. If he would have continued, he would have been maybe one of the greatest regional scientists in the world. But did he ever, that was my question, did he ever come back to his original analysis? At some stage, he became more famous. It was translated to English, from German into English. So someone, I think, he must have returned to his original analysis. There's a simple second question, you see, he was always in the shadow of his brother Max. And I can tell you, I really admire his brother Max. But his brother Max, he was famous for many things, not only sociology, but also economic historian, etc. But he also wrote a book on regional science, i.e. The City. And his book on The City is one of the first comprehensive books on what a city is. It's more sociological, of course. It's not formal mathematical, but it has a wealth of things. So how did the two brothers go along these lines?
I think that there was a bit of rivalry between the two brothers. I think that, but I could maybe have misinterpreted what I've read and so forth. But I think that Alfred really looked up to his brother, and his brother definitely cast. He was older. He was the oldest of the 8 siblings, and he definitely casts a big shadow. And so, if you will, I think that his father also produced a very, very rich, fertile environment for these two brothers to be steeped in culture and sociology and politics and the law and so forth very early on. So I think that in a way, even though that Alfred was, his major habilitation degree was in studying agrarian issues and so forth in law. I think that if anything, Alfred was more of a bit of a sociologist within the context of looking at industry and saying, oh, look at these patterns and look at how industrial locations have to be organized between raw materials and demands and markets and so forth. I think that that was clearly an interesting work, but it wasn't his main theme. I don't think ever. I think it was more in terms of culture, philosophy, sociology, and so forth.
I thank you. I think we've used up our time here. I apologize. I'm very excited about doing more of this, but I think we need to turn it over to Peter, who's going to talk to us about Ornato Gini. So I'm very excited about that as well. Peter, it's your screen.
Okay, can you see the screen? I've tried to share it.
I can indeed.
Okay, very good. I want to first say that I really enjoyed Rick's talk about Weber, and it really, in a lot of ways, there are a lot of parallels in terms of the general themes that came out during Rick's talk, and some of the ones I think you'll hear here, namely, you know, foreshadowing a bit, you know, he came from a good family. There were some of his main contributions. It turns out relatively recently we found out that there are antecedents, and yet in the end, Genie contributed much more in terms of depth. And if you go back and look at his original contributions, you see the sort of depth and breadth of what he contributed. And as well, he's just as well known in other disciplines as he is in geography, economics, and regional science. So kind of interesting. So Genie lived during the late 19th century and throughout a good part of the 20th century. He was born in Mata de Lavenza in the province of Treviso, which is about 60 kilometers northeast of Venice. And he studied at the University of Bologna law, math, economics, and biology. So again, his background was in a variety of fields. And throughout his career, he became very well known in statistics and demography in particular, but also in sociology and economics. And his work has had just a tremendous impact on again, as we'll see, many fields, including geography and regional science. Here's a brief chronology of some of the highlights of sort of his early and mid-career. He gave his first paper at the age of 24, where he was interested in providing evidence to support the idea that the tendency to produce children of a given sex was an inheritable trait. A couple of years later, he became chair of statistics at the University of Cagliari, and 3 years later, accepted that same position at Padua. He started a couple of journals, long-lasting journals throughout his career, in Metron, which publishes papers in statistics and applications of statistics, just celebrated its centennial last year. And he, skipping down a bit, also founded the journal Genus, which is a journal on population sciences and population studies, and it too has continued to the present day. He had a number of governmental positions. He was chairman of the Central Institute of Statistics. He founded the Italian Committee for the Study of Population Problems. And this was an organization that had a lot of sort of downstream effects. It led to the World Population Congresses, the journal that I just mentioned, and there were a number of expeditions that he managed and led to study isolated populations. He also had a number of positions in academic societies, in particular, president of both the Italian Sociological Society and the Italian Statistical Society. He along the way accumulated a number of honorary degrees, including in different disciplines: sociology, 1934, in the sciences in general by Harvard University during its 300th anniversary, and in social sciences in the early 1960s. Now, to give you some rough idea of where I'm headed here, the next sections I'm going to talk about the Gini Coefficient, for which of course he is best known. I want to talk about some of the spatial considerations associated with that and how regional scientists have taken that in different directions. And I want to look at his further contributions in a number of areas as well, including the median center. You know, again, the p-median problem. We'll see that Genie had something to say about that early on in his career. Price indexes and international comparisons, again, a subject that regional scientists have tackled. We'll look at that. And also, when one looks at classification accuracy and measures of agreement, we'll see that Genie had a lot of the early ideas for those subsequent measures that were developed can be traced back to Genie. And finally, in this category, measures of diversity, species richness, for example, and different kinds of entropy also had their roots in a lot of what Genie did. And touch briefly on his contributions to population studies as well. So the Gini coefficient, just sort of a brief review. Of course, this is the most widely known of Genie's contributions. It's sometimes called the Genie coefficient, Genie index, Genie ratio, but essentially it is a way to measure inequality, and it's been used predominantly in the area of income inequality, but it can be used for other types of inequality as well. For example, population density and population distribution over space. The Gini coefficient is a number that varies from 0 to 1, and it is, I'll skip ahead here just one slide. It's the, as I think many of us know, it's that the area enclosed in that polygon there divided by the area below the 45-degree line. And it's, this is on a graph of cumulative distributions. In this case, cumulative population versus cumulative income. So for example, here, point A says 30% of the population has just 10% of the income. And so it was Genie who devised this numerical measure for Lorenz's earlier curve. Lorenz had maybe 5 to 6 or 7 years earlier described this graphical device for portraying the relationship between cumulative distributions, and Genie came up with his index. Right. So now towards the bottom here, one of the things that's noted is that this measure is equal to the expected amount of income that would have to be transferred if 2 random people in the population were to meet. Okay. So, and it's expressed in terms, in relative terms, relative to mean income. So essentially, what it is based upon, what Genie's coefficient is based upon, is what's known as Genie's mean difference. Okay, the mean difference is the expected absolute value of the difference between 2 observations in a distribution. Okay, so again, at the heart of Genie's ratio is this Genie's mean difference. Again, the expected difference between 2 observations. And this essentially is really what Genie is best known for, not only in terms of the measure of inequality that it's led to, but just in terms of a statistical quantity. You can think of this quantity as an alternative way to measure variability in populations. So, for example, the variance is just the expected squared difference between 2 observations, again, divided by 2. And some people, again, I'm not going to go into technical detail here, in part because I'm not sure I have the depth to do that. But in any case, there have been a number of papers written describing some of the merits of Genie's mean difference as a measure of variability relative to the variance. Now, here's I had this slide later on in the talk, but after Rick's talk, I moved it up a little bit to be kind of consistent with what he was doing. As I was preparing this, I came across a paper by the statistician David, and in his review of measures of variability, he noted that there were a number of papers in the late 1860s and early 1870s that also examined properties of this quantity, this expected value of the difference, absolute difference between 2 observations from a distribution. And Genie, says he only became aware of these after his own work had been published. And these, were articles that were fairly obscure articles in a German astronomical journal. So they didn't really get a lot of publicity. But we'll come back to this as well. And we'll see the sort of the rich development that Genie made, not only of this particular measure of variability, but other measures as well. And this is one of the things that's very hard to get a handle on without going very deeply into Genie's work. I mean, this was the measure of variability he was most known for, but he had many other measures of variability as well. And some of this will come out in subsequent slides here. Now, if we look at some of the spatial manifestations of applications of Gini's coefficient, measures of inequality have what we might think of as the characteristic of anonymity. In the context of residential segregation, Michael White years ago talked about the checkerboard problem. In other words, if you have income distributed over space and you're looking to measure the inequality, different spatial patterns of where those people are can lead to the same global measure, in this case, the same Gini index. So what we really want to do as regional scientists is to take into account not only how much inequality there is, but where it is and the spatial pattern of it. So Serge Ray and some of his co-authors have looked at this. One way to do this is to decompose the Gini coefficient into pairwise contributions that are close to one another and other pairwise observations that are not close to one another. So you can look at not only the inequality, but the spatial autocorrelation as well. So there's been some work then done on sort of the effect of spatial dependence on measures of inequality. Just as we look at how spatial dependence affects things like regression analysis, we can look at how it affects measures of inequality. There's a quantity known as Genie Correlation, which essentially is a measure of how a variable varies with the cumulative distribution of another variable. And this is exactly what occurs with local Moran's I. We look at how a variable is related to the sum of surrounding variables. So this is one way that has been used to look at spatial dependence and how it affects regional inequality. We also have locational Gini coefficients. Krugman was instrumental in bringing these to the fore. And if you take location quotients for an industry in a region, we can look at essentially the spatial distribution of those location quotients. So when that measure is near zero, we have employment that's spread out across regions. When it's near 1/2, the sector's employment is very concentrated in one region. So again, this is directly related to Gini's measure of inequality, in this case looking at employment distribution throughout space. There's also been following up on Gini's index some discussion of whether or not Gini's coefficient should be weighted by population. So if you have a map of Gini coefficients and you want to try to estimate the global inequality in the population along the lines of income, one can ask, should those local Ginis be weighted by population? And again, there's a debate in the literature about this, but in general, the sort of majority opinion, I think, is that these provide kind of poor estimates of interpersonal income inequality. It's also led to other measures of concentration in geography and regional science. So, for example, there's a centralization index that's been designed to look at the relative concentration of groups around a center, and that too has its foundations in the Gini coefficient. This is just a graph here showing you that the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient can actually be broken down, can be disaggregated. So we have the shaded regions in this curve is essentially being kind of little mini Gini coefficients for the lower part of the distribution and for the upper part of the distribution. So you can actually decompose the Gini coefficient into inequality along the income distribution itself. Okay, so he also contributed to other measures of concentration and in sociology, dissimilarity. There's the well-known Hoover index of population concentration. This is sometimes known as the Robin Hood Index. It's essentially 1/2 the difference between the share of population and the share of area in a region. And this has been used in sociology. The Duncan's Index of Dissimilarity looks at the difference in proportions of two groups of populations across regions. And these measures, Hoover Index and Duncan's Index, correspond to, let's see, whoops, wrong way, correspond to the maximum vertical distance between the 45-degree line and the Lorenz curve. So the distance here, BE, is the Hoover Index, or the Duncan's Index of Dissimilarity. And there are, it's been noted that Genie himself was responsible for some of those measures. So Duncan, for example, gives credit to Hoover in 1941 for coming up with that measure. But Goodman and Kruskal note that Genie himself was responsible for coming up with those Hoover and Duncan indexes as well. And that the Genie index has been used in geography and regional science in the context not only of income, but segregation and population as well. And these are just some references to those applications. Okay, so I want to turn now to some other areas that Genie contributed to. And the first of these is the median center of population. In looking at the history of center points, there's a paper in the late 1930s that notes that the US Bureau of the Census doesn't quite get it right in saying that the mean center of population, the balance point, center of mass, so to speak, is the point of minimum aggregate travel. We know that this is, the mean center is the point that minimizes the sum of squared distances. So they noted that basic error there. And they related how it was really Genie and Galvani in the late 1920s who were really the first to point out that error, and the first to suggest the now accepted term median center for the point of minimum aggregate travel. So now, I'm not sure how much Genie and Galvani did to solve that problem, but they were aware of it. They pointed out the Census Bureau error. They gave a name to the median center, to the point of minimum aggregate travel. And they combined with Berard Dini's to write about the more general topic of the means of bivariate distributions, and they applied their methods to geographic problems. Now, I haven't taken the time yet to go back to that particular article. And even if I do take the time, it might be in Italian, so there'd be a little bit of an issue there. But I think it would be very interesting to see what they did, because Weisfeld's iterative solution didn't appear to 1937. I'm not totally convinced that they have the solution there in their 1933 paper, but it would be, I think, very interesting to see how far they got and what they had to say. Of course, this whole area, the p-median problem has a long and rich tradition within regional science, and it's really about 50 years now since this topic began to be discussed at regional science meetings, and it's really just been a big part of regional science ever since. And I've put down a few of the reviews there. I'm sure there are many more. Okay, the EKS index and international comparisons. When one looks at GDP and purchasing power, the question arises, how can you compare those across countries? There are many different ways to do this. And the EKS index, volume and price index, is one way to do this. And it was developed in the 1960s, and it has its antecedents in the work of Fisher from 1922 and Genie in 1924. And among the contributions here, Genie was the first to suggest this particular approach that is now the predominant way to look at international purchasing power comparisons. And it turns out, again, I don't have the details here at hand, but the index itself arises from the solution to a least squares problem. So again, Genie thought a lot about these things and had contributions that led to important applications such as this. Let's skip over this. Okay, now there's a whole additional area, indexes of agreement and classification accuracy, that Genie had contributions to. And these in turn have had a number of applications in different subfields within regional science. When we talk about indexes of agreement, you can make a couple of different general points. One is that sort of like statistics, different statistics being useful in different situations, having different statistical powers against different alternatives. The same is true for measures of agreement. There are many different measures of agreement. Some of them work better in some cases, some work better in others. And so it's hard to compare them. But what I'm going to do here in the next few minutes is to talk a little bit about the distinction between a single classification table, where you're just trying to classify data, and the other is where you have a threshold. So it's sort of a degree of freedom where you can choose a threshold to maximize the accuracy of your classification system. So for example, in epidemiology, sometimes we look at cutoff values that are going to give you the best classification in terms of accuracy. The most widely used measure of agreement is Cohen's kappa index, which essentially is a chance standardized version of the probability of correct classification. Like, in other words, how often do you put things in the right class, and how often would you have done that by chance? So it's kind of the improvement over chance. The main point here, though, is that Cohen's kappa, it turns out, is very similar to three separate indexes that Genie developed earlier in, I think it was the 1920s or so. And there have been comparisons of Cohen's kappa with these different measures that Genie developed. And essentially, Genie's results are very similar to Cohen's kappa. And one of Genie's measures is essentially a standardized version of kappa itself. So this measure of agreement that Cohen's kappa is used has a maximum, and you can essentially standardize it. So again, the point here is that the antecedents for these came in the work of Genie. And with regard to regional science, I'll just mention that, as examples of the areas of application, classifying trip activities from GPS data, especially in land use analysis, classification has been very important as well. So although kappa is by far the most widely used statistic, certainly Genie's measures could be used as well. And in any case, they're the antecedents for Cohen's kappa. Let me say a little bit more about this notion of a threshold. We can, as I said, have a threshold to maximize the classification measure of agreement in any, for example, 2x2 table. And simulations have been done of different types of measures. And if you're trying to estimate what the true threshold is, Genie's index and a maximum chi-square statistic perform the best at estimating a true threshold when the probability of being above that threshold is low. There are other statistics that do better in other circumstances. Now, along these lines, one of the things that's sort of been of interest to me over the last few months is to sort of finally get straight. I mean, I think we're all aware in statistics that we have, type 1 errors and we have type 2 errors. And then in epidemiology, you hear sensitivity and specificity. And then in other fields, you hear about receiver operating characteristics and false positives. And So all these terms get floated around, and they're all, of course, different ways of saying the same thing. But the main point here is that the Gini index, that we all know and love, is directly related to these to all of these terms that I just mentioned. So the receiver operating characteristic curve is essentially a plot, a graphical plot of sensitivity versus the false positive rate, where sensitivity is the number of true positives divided by true positives plus false negatives. So in any case, you get a curve. The 45-degree line is kind of what you would get if you randomly guessed what was going on. And the receiver operating characteristic curve is a bent, bowed out curve that is kind of a mirror image of the Lorenz curve. It's kind of on the other side of the 45-degree line. And the Gini coefficient is equal to the area under that curve, or it's as it says down here, the Gini coefficient is equal to twice the area under that curve minus 1. So the Gini coefficient of 1 means the model is 100% accurate, and it's equal to 0 when the model assigns random values to all the predictions. So that's kind of interesting. The kappa statistic has been extended to a spatial setting. So we have what is known as a fuzzy kappa statistic, where you're looking not only at a particular subregion or a cell on a map, but you're looking at the cells surrounding it as well. And of course, this makes that much more of a spatial type of measure. Okay, Gini and measures of diversity. So in addition to the well-known Gini coefficient, he's also well known for his measure of entropy. Okay, so it's given by that equation there. So if we have Pi is the probability that an object belongs to class I, there are n classes. This is the probability that two elements chosen at random don't come from the same class. Okay, so again, it's a measure of entropy. And a large number of fields have kind of rediscovered this and have different names for essentially what was Gini's entropy. The Simpson's index, for example, is a measure of diversity. And it's just equal to 1 minus G. It's equal to the probability that two random elements come from the same class. In ecology, it's been called the Gini-Simpson index. And it's interpreted as the probability of interspecific encounters, so that two elements of the population get together. What's the probability that they're from different classes? In economics, Simpson's index is the Hirschman-Herfindahl index, where PI is the market share in firm I. So again, this is yet another area, another subfield where Gini's entropy comes into play. It's known as the Gibbs-Martin index in sociology and psychology. It's known as the Blau index in sociology. It's used in population genetics. And in regional science, it's used in land use diversity, diversity of migrants in different occupational sectors, and in measures of cultural diversity. So again, a wide range of applications to many fields. This same quantity is known as Gini impurity when used in classification and decision trees. I'll start to speed up a little bit as my time gets a little smaller here. And it's also been generalized in physics to the concept of what's known as Salas entropy. And so the equation you see there in the middle of the page is a general form, and Gini's index of diversity is the special case where the parameter Q is equal to 2. And the widely known Boltzmann-Gibbs entropy is the special case where the parameter Q approaches 1. And so I think this is interesting in its own right, the fact that Gini has, his measure of entropy has been used in so many fields, but it's also of interest in some direct sense to us too, because of the importance of information theory and entropy maximization and so on within regional science. There is a connection between this measure that I just mentioned, Genie's entropy, and his mean difference. So you can, for example, if you're looking at Genie's mean difference in the case of qualitative variables, 0, 1 variables, you can derive Genie's entropy from that special case of Genie's mean difference with qualitative variables. Genie contributed a lot to population studies, and this is just a summary, an overview, a table showing over time, different time periods, his contributions to a number of different subfields within demography, ranging from migration to historical demography to population theories and population policy. I think it's important to note that Genie, with respect to his population work, was the head of the Italian Eugenics Society for a while, and had a period of time where he was very interested in fascism and was a unofficial, if not official, advisor to Mussolini. But his relationship to those things was very complex in a lot of ways, because he was also dismissed from a lot of his positions because he argued against a lot of government policies. So, you know, reading there, it's a very mixed perspective one gets. That doesn't, it's mixed and complex in part because I think it changes over time. And to sort of close out here, then let me just say that he has many other contributions as well. I've only touched on some of them, the ones that I think are the most important with respect to applications, subsequent applications in regional science. These contributions have been both direct and indirect. Much of what he contributed was rediscovered and reintroduced in different disciplines at different times over the years. And just to close with a couple of examples of this, there's a form of regression known as Genie Regression, which, instead of being based on the sum of squared residuals that you're trying to minimize when you fit that line through a set of points, it's based on his absolute differences between pairs of residuals. And it turns out that it's much more robust and not as sensitive to outliers. In a very early contribution, Genie discussed subjective probability and inductive probability, and in some ways anticipated a lot of the future developments in Bayesian probability. And more recently, just in the last 5 years or so, there's been sort of a construction of sort of a logic of Genie's entropy. Logical theory of entropy leads to some of the measures that Genie developed. So I think I'll stop there. Well, I will stop there. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's great value. I think this whole thing has been really, really insightful. Thank you, Peter. And
thank you.
Rick, we really appreciate it. I would like to open it up for questions if people want to do that. But first, I'd like to give it to Peter Nijkamp to make some comments, and then we can have some discussion after that. Peter?
Thank you, Kingsley. Well, let me begin by thanking both Peter and Rick for absolutely a great speech. This is exactly what we wanted to have when we started this Great Minds in Regional Science series. You take a historical figure, you look into what he has said, you are familiar with what he has done, and then you try to extrapolate the work he has done to the current era and maybe even beyond. And so both Rick and Peter have done a really good job. Now, of course, my task was not only to thank them, I was also asked to make a few more synthesis comments on the whole of this morning session. And I will keep it short because we are a little bit running out of time. But we had also, before the Great Mind session, we had some very interesting papers. They were all centering on the possible spatial impacts of the corona crisis, COVID-19, and both Dan Zamansky and his team, and Geneviève and Marina Toger and others, they presented really solid work. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of uncertainty. The world is full of virologists, and everyone is apparently or seemingly an expert in the field, but hardly anyone is basing his views or her views on solid empirical work. And this is what we have seen this morning, and I really like that. A few observations. The question of COVID-19 is not only a medical question, it's also, of course, a social, it's an economic, and certainly also a geographical and a regional science question. And I've already seen sometimes in the literature a new term popping up, the geography of corona. And I think what we will see in the next years to come is a lot of work on the geography of corona, and not from a medical or speculative perspective, but certainly also from a model-based and statistical perspective. Now, it prompts various questions, very fundamental questions, also in regional science and geography and regional economics, because we have always had a strong belief in agglomeration economies. And gradually now we are aware of agglomeration diseconomies. But what is the nature of these diseconomies? Density was always a popular concept. Now we are aware of the threats of density, and you only look into the statistical maps and figures worldwide, and you see there is, of course, an immediate correlation between the concentration of the coronavirus, number of infections, and density. So, but that means, of course, we have to formulate much more precisely what is density. Is there an optimal density? And is density something per square kilometer? Or is density maybe something very much more almost at an individual level or a household level? These are questions which I think will bother us. Only a macroscopic perspective will not tell us the right insights, which we would need to fully understand the external conditions under which the spread of a virus will take place. So there should be more scope for microscopic type of research. The same, that's another thing, holds not only for density, but also for interaction, another factor of agglomeration economies. And of course, we can have different types of interaction, virtual, physical, and substitution thereof. And we have seen in particular substitution phenomena between virtual and physical interaction. We have seen the maps also from San Francisco, and we have seen the maps from Stockholm in Sweden, and the maps from Israel, and so on. But again, degree of interaction is not yet the precisely variable we need, because it depends on frequency, it depends on intensity, it depends on the type of interaction, etc. And again, I would argue to make a fruitful progress in the research, more individual, micro-based behavioral analysis is absolutely necessary. And then, of course, there are the broader issues, because there may be real effects, there may be perceived effects, perceived threats, etc. But it all has implications for rent levels, it has implications for land use, it has implications for residential choices, etc. Geneviève was already mentioning that in San Francisco there might be a rapid decline in rent levels, for instance. But in other countries, we still see, even in high density areas, a rapid rise in rent levels. So there are all kinds of intervening factors. We are not yet sure about what is happening and what is underneath the surface. And that means that behind the scene, there's a whole range of phenomena coming up. Will there be a new trend toward a specific type of urbanization, a further suburbanization, some sort of an urban ruralization, etc. These are all the scenarios which are sometimes in the mind of people. And we might see a flight out of the cities towards suburbs and rural areas. Or alternatively, we might also see a reverse movement, young people moving into city areas and elderly people moving out. So you would get some sort of an interesting segregation between cities and suburban areas with different population groups, not only income groups, but also age groups. So there might be new societies emerging. Now, some of us have argued that there will not be something like a post-corona city, and others have argued the post-corona city will be completely different. Now, somewhere in between, and with experiences in different countries, there is still enormous scope for further research. And some of these things are not always leading to, for the time being at least, to unambiguous findings and results. To give an example, and we did also some experiments ourselves, we know that corona, either through lockdown measures or as a result of perceived dangers of interaction and mobility, that mobility patterns have drastically changed. Traffic jams have gone down dramatically in many countries, etc. In some countries even don't exist anymore, including a densely populated country like the Netherlands, even though people are still mobile. But if there are these changes, would that mean that if you would overlay the map of corona infections with the map of origin destinations of mobility, would there be a close correlation? Now, apparently our first findings do not show there is so much of a close correlation. And if there is somewhere a correlation, if you have mobility patterns, it's always from A to B. Would then the higher infection rates be found in A, the origin, or in the destination? Even that is uncertain. So what I would essentially argue, we have to look much more carefully into all these patterns. We do not yet know so much about medical disease models, and they are not very reliable for the time being. And we do not yet know that much about the threats of the built environment and which type of built environment in respect of the possible chances to be infected by the coronavirus. So there's an enormous research agenda, and what the Reason Science Academy has tried to do is to put together. Some people have done some interesting and nice statistical and solid modeling work. This is the beginning of a new type of tradition, perhaps in the regional science. And we hope that also on the next occasion, we'll come back and have more findings, and we need more experiences from people all over the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. A good group, good time. Thank you very much. A lot of other activities going on now. Karima, do you have anything you want to do?
Well, I think we should close up because some people have another meeting.
Great.
But sorry, Kingsley?
Thank you then. We'll close it down.
Okay. Thank you very much.